We've got a fascinating and honestly a pretty surprising story for you today. It's all about global economics and how two huge countries, really just acting in their own self-interest, ended up accidentally stabilizing the entire world's energy market. All right, let's get right into it.
Okay, let's rewind the clock to early 2022. The war in Ukraine had just started, and you could feel the panic ripping through the energy markets. Western sanctions on Russian oil were on the horizon, and the price of Brent crude, the global benchmark, it just skyrocketed to nearly $137 a barrel. Analysts, well, they were seriously bracing for a full-blown global energy crisis.
I mean, it really felt like the world was teetering on the edge, an edge of a massive inflationary shock, all driven by these runaway energy prices. But that catastrophe never quite happened, did it? So the question is, why? What pulled the market back from the brink? The answer is probably not what you're thinking.
Well, the answer starts with this massive pivot to the east. See, as Western countries started to back away from Russian oil, millions and millions of barrels every single day suddenly needed to find a new home. And where that oil ended up, well, it completely redrew the global energy map.
To really get the scale of this change, just look at India. Before 2022, Russian oil was, well, it was basically a nothing to them. We're talking less than 1% of their total imports. Fast forward to 2024, and that number has just exploded to nearly 40%. This wasn't some gradual trend, it was a seismic shift that happened almost overnight.
And when you see it visually like this, the change is just wow. It's stark. In just 2 years, India went from being a tiny, almost non-existent buyer to one of Russia's most important energy customers. This wasn't just a simple trade adjustment, This is the creation of a whole new energy relationship, one built on incredible speed and massive volume.
And here's the thing, India wasn't the only one. China also jumped in a huge way, soaking up about 2 million barrels of Russian crude every single day. So you add them together, and these two nations were buying nearly 4 million barrels a day. They effectively built a new home for all that supply the West was trying to push off the market.
So, okay, why should you care about this? Whether you're sitting in New Delhi, New York, or London? Well, because this gigantic shift to the east had a profound, and I really mean profound, stabilizing effect on the entire global economy. Let me break down how. Let's just pause for a second and run a little thought experiment. What would have happened if those millions of barrels of Russian oil had just vanished from the market? If nobody had been there to buy them? The fallout would have been, well, dire. You're talking about a massive chunk of the world's oil supply just disappearing. Prices would have almost certainly shot way past that panic peak of $137. That would have kicked off a severe global inflationary shock, messing up supply chains and just hammering economies everywhere. It's a scenario that, frankly, even Western leaders were desperate to avoid.
And to put a number on it, at their peak, these purchases by India and China made up roughly 4% of the entire global oil market. Now, 4% might not sound like a lot, but in a commodity market this tight, taking 4% of the supply offline practically overnight is a recipe for absolute chaos. By stepping in, they kept those barrels flowing and prevented a catastrophic global shortage.
Now, this is where the story gets even more interesting and a little more complex. To really get the full picture, you gotta look past just the oil and see the pragmatic and sometimes contradictory world of global trade.
Because while all the headlines were focused on oil, it's so important to remember that other types of trade with Russia didn't just grind to a halt. Actually, for a lot of Western nations, very strategic trade kept right on going, just in different categories.
So, check this out. While India's imports were almost all crude oil, the EU kept importing tens of billions of euros worth of other stuff. Think natural gas, nickel, fertilizers. And at the same time, the US, while leading the pressure campaign, was still buying strategic materials like uranium and palladium from Russia. So you get this absolutely fascinating dynamic playing out. On one side, you've got India and China buying up discounted oil, which kind of indirectly keeps a lid on global energy prices for everybody. And on the other side, you have the US and EU sanctioning that very same oil while still doing their own strategic shopping for goods that are critical to their own economies. It's a textbook case of realpolitik, right? Where every country is just acting in its own economic interest.
Okay, so let's tie all this together. What's the big takeaway from all of this? What does it really mean for global stability?
When you boil it all down, the key point is this. By adapting to this new reality, the actions of India and China stopped prices from going through the roof and prevented a whole lot more volatility. Whatever their reasons were, the direct consequence was that they prevented a much worse economic crisis for everyone. They became, in effect, the world's most unlikely shock absorbers.
And that kind of leaves us with one last big question to chew on. In a world this deeply interconnected, where a decision made in one capital can literally stop a crisis in another, who really holds the power? Who's really in control of energy prices? Is it the old-school producers, the sanctioning superpowers, or is it the rising consumers who can redraw the entire map overnight? It's something to think about. Thanks for digging into this with us.